Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our SBP Standards launch webinar today. I'm very happy to see so many people have joined the session today from all over the world. My name is Carsten Hullius. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of SBP, and I'd like to give a brief introduction of how we have gotten to this point and then hand over to our Standards Manager, Laszlo Mate, to present a high-level summary of the revised standards, as well as information on standards effective date and transition period, and as well as on trainings and workshops. But before we start, here are some housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available for all of you next week on our YouTube channel, and we'll send you a link once this is published. Also note that cameras and microphones are disabled. If you have any questions, please do use the Q&A function to submit your questions during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time to answer as many of the submitted questions as possible. Please also note that we will circulate a very short feedback survey to you right after the webinar, so please do share your feedback with us. Let's get started. So after SBP was founded in 2013, the initial SBP Standards, or the SBP framework in the version 1.0, as it was called at the time, was published in 2015. And best practice in voluntary standard setting prescribes that standards should be revised on a regular basis, and that means every 5 years. With the intention to apply continuous improvements, there are very many good reasons for regular reviews and revisions of standards. For instance, the changing of markets, evolving or new regulation, as we've seen with the RED II, for example, lessons learned, and potential merging of documents like guidance or interpretations or other either into or out of the standards, and a lot of more things. So overall, standards need to stay relevant, and therefore from time to time we need to amend them for future fitness. So regarding the SBP standards, we've been guided by several objectives over the years. First of all, increase fungibility of woody biomass to enable global trade. Second, include relevant regulatory requirements on legality and sustainability. And third, make best use of existing voluntary certification for biomass feedstock. So we want SBP to continue to be the one-stop shop for you, the certification system of choice for the global woody biomass to energy sector. A company strategy provides a corridor for me as captain to navigate the SBP ship in. It enables us to reach the dedicated ports with the expected freight on board. So throughout my 7 years, and it has in May been 7 years with SBP, we've had 3 rounds of strategy review. The most recent one started last year and was finalized just some weeks ago. I am very pleased to inform you that in the next weeks, we will publish our strategy document, the strategy to 2025 in the context of 2030. In the strategy document, apart from many other interesting things, we present our core strategy, the SBP Galaxy that you can see here on the slide. So in the middle, we have our purpose to expand the contribution of good biomass to the global bioeconomy. And surrounding that, we have 4 strategic aims. This is what we want to achieve over time. And surrounding that, we have 5 focus areas. Those are the work streams that we want to utilize to achieve our strategic aims. And framing it all, we have the 4 values: integrity, credibility, transparency, and inclusivity that accompany our day-to-day work. Now, what does that have to do with the strategy and the SBP standards? How does that connect? The standards, in my opinion, are always the starting point, and the outputs and outcomes of the standard revision process played an absolute key role in informing the development of our strategy. Strategy is built around and very closely related to the standards. If you just remind yourself of the purpose, to expand the contribution of good biomass to the global bioeconomy, we define good biomass in our standard number 1. Within the strategic aims, we also define 2 strategic aims directly related to the standard, defined and certified good biomass and grow acceptance and recognition of the SBP standards. And also within the 5 focus areas, we have 2 of them related to the standards. One of them is standards development and regulatory compliance, and the other one is certification and assurance. So overall, and very clearly, standards and strategy go hand in hand, and the strategy can only be successful if we have a workable, accepted toolbox of standards. Even we celebrate our 10-year anniversary this year, SBP, compared to other voluntary certification schemes, is still a very new and young scheme. It was our first standards review and revision process. And as with all things that we do for the first time, the process was not perfect. There were many lessons learned during the process, and we are now in a much better position to prepare for the next revision, which will start in 5 years. We can now proudly say that what has been developed in multi-stakeholder consensus is much better than before. And by saying this, I'd like to thank the more than 200 stakeholders that have engaged throughout the process. Special thanks to my team, the SBP Secretariat team, for their excellent work, as well as to the chairs of the working groups and the members, technical committee, the SBP Standards Committee, and the SBP Board of Directors. Without you guys, this wouldn't have been possible. And now I'd like to hand over to Laszlo to give you a more detailed overview of what's new in the SBP Standards.
Carsten, thank you very much for the introduction and the overview on the recent developments in SBP. I would also like to welcome all the participants and thank you very much for your time and that you made available to attend this presentation. Personally, I think it was useful to have the slides on the strategy to be reminded on how the revision of the SBP standards fits with the broader strategic objectives of the organization. So to start with, I just wanted to clarify the objectives we have set for the session today. So we wanted to provide a high-level overview of the standard revision process, including some of the key changes in the standards, but also to outline the next steps for the transition period, which is obviously an important element for implementing the new standards. We are not intending to provide a detailed explanation of the changes at indicator level. We have a set of training sessions, online training session, planned for the next couple of months, followed by in-person training sessions in the key producer and consumer regions, where the focus will be on detailed presentation of the changes, but also considering some of the regional aspects that the implementation of the new standards will require. First of all, I would like to start with how we got here. So here is a quick reminder on the revision process. This slide presents the various milestones of the revision process. We can see the key stages, such as the working groups developing the first drafts, the public consultations, but also the reviews by the SBP governing bodies, specifically the SBP Technical Committee, Standards Committee, and the Board. We also see steps taken by the SBP Secretariat to address some of the topics like principle-free forest carbon and free prior and informed consent. Moving on to the changes themselves. First of all, I would like to mention that the revision process has resulted in some structural changes, and this is what we see on this slide. For the first time, the revised standards have been published or will be published with standalone guidance documents for SBP Standards 1, 2, and 4. So these are the standards that, in our views, are most important standards for the certificate holders. And the objective is to support implementation and interpretation of the requirements. The revised standards have been streamlined and the emphasis was placed on driving improvements and outcomes. and the indicators were worded with the intent of moving away from process indicators to outcome-based indicators. Talking about compliance and regulatory compliance, obviously this is a crucial aspect of the SBP framework. It is important to mention here that the SBP requirements surpass regulatory requirements in a number of areas, including biodiversity, forest carbon, engagement with local communities, including indigenous peoples. So what's actually new? While the structural changes are obviously important and clearer language and clear indicators will help more effective implementation, improving the actual sustainability requirements in line with new scientific evidence, regulatory requirements, and stakeholder expectations was the main objective of the standard review. In the following slides, I will give you a high-level overview of these changes. And I will start with probably the most important SBP standard. SBP Standard 1 covers the various sustainability requirements, environmental, social, forest carbon, against which regional risk assessments or supply-based evaluations are conducted. These requirements on environment and biodiversity have been strengthened to ensure a robust protection of key species, habitats, and ecosystems. The indicator referring to no conversion areas has also been revised and strengthened. And finally, I would like to mention that a requirement has been added that specifies that forested land must be regenerated, and additional safeguards have been introduced on chemical use. Moving on to a crucial element of biomass sustainability, carbon, specifically forest carbon. Principle 3 is a completely new principle dedicated to forest carbon. It includes land use change, and forestry requirements, and also some additional requirements considered important by our stakeholders. For example, safeguards have been introduced to prevent feedstock sourcing from areas of low productivity or sites that are difficult to regenerate. The revised standard also requires producers to avoid feedstock from forests that are characterized both as high carbon stock and as high conservation value. Additionally, the revised standard includes the principle of cascading use, which is a principle long discussed in the biomass sustainability field, prohibiting the use of high quality stem wood to be used as biomass feedstock if it's in substantial demand for long-lived products. Still on Standard 1, in line with developments in other voluntary schemes, the social and labor indicators have been strengthened. The requirements for labor conditions have been improved, and the revised standard also places additional responsibilities on certificate holders to consider the rights of local communities. Here we have also strengthened the indicators that relate to indigenous peoples, and free, prior, and informed consent is now part of the SBP normative framework. Moving on to Standard 2, the SBP Standard 2 is the engine behind SBP certification. It covers the normative framework for conducting risk assessment against the SBP Standard 1. The revised standards provide greater clarity on how risk assessment should be conducted. It also introduces the concept of benchmarked and recognized schemes, acknowledging the synergies with forest management certification. This specifically relates to how we handle feedstocks with an FSC and PFC claim. The requirements dealing with national legislation, stakeholder consultation, and the protection of confidential information has all been strengthened in the revised standard. Now for Standard 3. Standard 3 is probably a less known standard to certificate holders. It's a standard for SBP accredited certification bodies. Nonetheless, it's obviously a crucial part of the assurance framework of SBP. This revised version of the standard has strengthened the auditor and peer review competency requirements. We have also updated the definition of non-conformities, aligned them with best practice, and we have provided greater clarity on checks to be conducted during surveillance audit. Also looking at some of the issues we had with report finalization, for example, we have provided clearer timelines for certification bodies to perform various tasks. This standard also introduces updates on audit planning and sampling. Okay, moving on to standard number 4, which is the SBP's chain of custody standard. The revised standard removes the obligation for SBP certificate holders to hold an FSC or PFC chain of custody certificate, and it introduces SBP's own chain of custody system. It spells out requirements of various aspects of chain of custody management, but it also includes aspects such as health and safety and anti-corruption, similar to FSC, for example. This revised standard also introduces our new mass balance system. SBP Standard 5, this is an important standard for data collection. It sets out the requirement for recording and communicating accurate data to allow greenhouse gas calculation emissions resulting from harvesting, production, and transport of biomass. This revised standard makes the communication of dynamic data mandatory for all certificate holders. Finally, SBP Standard 6 is solely focused on the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. Certificate holders along the supply chain can use the data collected and communicated to calculate their greenhouse gas and energy balances, including the greenhouse gas savings. At this stage, Standard 6 remains an optional standard. So that was the brief overview on the key changes with regards to the SBP standard. I also wanted to highlight some other relevant developments which will be important for the implementation of the revised standards. So in line with the decision by the SBP Standards Committee, EU RED II compliance has been included in the SBP certification requirements, and it's spelled out in the EU RED II bridging document, which is mandatory to all certificate holders. We are also in the process of revising the existing risk assessments that will be required for the implementation of the version 2 of the SBP standards. 4 regional risk assessments, concretely Denmark, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, are currently under public consultation, or I think in case of Denmark, the public consultation has just been recently concluded. For the regional risk assessments for British Columbia and Quebec, we are in the process of securing funding or identifying a working body at the time being. The revised regional risk assessments will incorporate the EU RED II requirements related to Article 29, paragraph 6 and 7, sustainability requirements for woody biomass. With the rollout of the revised standards, the SBP certification has now been extended to trees outside forest. This was mainly done at the request of our Danish stakeholders. And the dedicated instruction document is currently in the process of being published with the revised standards in mind. So until now, certification was only possible for biomass that resulted from forest resources. With the revised version 2 standard, certification of biomass will be possible also for feedstock that resulted from non-forest sources. My final two slides are about the transition process to the revised standards and the support for certificate holders and certification bodies. So please bear with me. We are quite close to the end. Transition period. Here we have the slides present the timeline to introduce the revised standards. As you see, the revised standards will become effective on the 10th of August 2023, followed by a 15-month transition period. Now, during the transition period, certificate holders will have the option to either use the legacy or the revised version of the standards. That means the current or the revised version of the SBP standards. I would, however, like to flag an important aspect, which is that all certificate holders, all SBP certificate holders will have to be compliant with the revised version of the standards by the end of the transition period. This means that by the 9th of November 2024, all SBP certificate holders are expected to be compliant with the revised standards. For countries or regions with an endorsed regional risk assessment, this is obviously conditional of a revised regional risk assessment to be in place. And revising in line with this, revising the existing regional risk assessment is a priority for the SBP Secretariat. During the transition period, the SBP Secretariat will collect feedback from certificate holders and certification bodies on the implementation of the revised standards. This will allow us to identify possible amendments or interpretation, if required, and changes in the guidance documents. A second aspect that I wanted to emphasize on is the support to the certificate holders and certification bodies. The SBP Secretariat is planning a series of online webinars with more technical details on the revised standards. The webinars are scheduled for the 6th and 7th of June 2023. This will be open to anybody. Registration and more information will be available soon. Additionally, additional training session will be conducted for certification bodies and peer reviewers on the 27th and 28th of June. Finally, between August and October this year, the SBP Secretariat will conduct a series of in-person training sessions in the key consumer and producer regions, and the calendar for these events will be published in due course. Finally, I would like to mention that the SBP Secretariat will track the uptake of the revised standards and collect, log, and address feedback received from certificate holders and certification bodies after each audit against the new standards. So I do encourage you to reach out to the SBP Secretariat if you have feedback on the new standards. And with this, we are done. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand it back to Carsten to open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Laszlo. As you have all seen, lots of ground has been covered by the process, and now we have the opportunity that when you have submitted your questions using the Q&A function, then we want to go through them. But before we do that, please note that this webinar is intended to provide an initial high-level overview. So detailed and technical Q&A is intended to be part of the online trainings, as mentioned by Laszlo, and also the in-person trainings that we plan to do. And by speaking of key sourcing and producing areas, we will look at having a workshop in Southeast Asia, 1 or 2 workshops in North America, and 1 in-person workshop in Europe. So that's the plan. And as soon as we know the dates, then we will keep you informed about that. So over to Nicholas and the questions. So maybe just repeat that if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. It should be on the top of your page, a little button called Q&A. You press, and then you can post your questions. We can only take written questions. We can't take any verbal questions.
Thank you, Carsten. So we have so far 2 questions. And the first one is, if when revising the chain of custody standard, we work on alignment and harmonizing with the ISO 22095. So, Laszlo, do you want to address that, or I can answer?
Yes, we have looked at some elements of it. I don't know what you exactly meant by harmonize, but it does contain all the key elements of general chain of custody management system, the revised standard.
Thank you. And the second one is with regard to the timeline for the evaluation of the new version by Guidehouse of the RED 2 approval bridging document.
Would Roman be able to take that question?
Otherwise, I can answer. So
Okay.
we have, as all known, we have received recognition against the EU requirements last September, and that was published on our website. The documents are available on the website in the section EU Red. And in the meantime, through the additional publication by the European Commission, we have upgraded and updated our document systems, and we have submitted them to the EU. So we are subject to the timeline of Guidehouse with the consultancy firm appointed by the European Commission to revise our documentation. And we are in the process of a second round of evaluation by Guidehouse. So it's not really within our control of the timeline. We are subject to theirs, and we are making all necessary steps to accelerate as much as we can. We have other questions coming up. So when are the version 2 standard ready to use for the certification bodies?
Thank you. So the effective date is 10th of August. This means that after the 10th of August, certification bodies will be able to use the revised standards. The implementation of the revised standards requires changes in a number of areas of reporting. So we are in the process of making those amendments, and we are aiming to make the system work from the 10th of August onwards. So that includes all the reporting system, but also ensuring that the certification bodies have their systems updated and their auditors have passed the relevant training.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. So there is a question about sharing the material, presentation material. Yes, it will be available. And the second one, how are the standard 1 risk assessments going forwards going to be made? Is it done by SBP or the certificate holders? I think we can remind the difference between regional risk assessment and these, what we call this supply-based evaluation.
Yeah, so there's two ways to conduct the risk assessments. Regional risk assessments cover a country or region, and these are done by independent working bodies. The supply-based evaluation can be conducted in-house by the certificate holder or its consultants. And the objective of the Secretariat is to have more regional risk assessment, because this ensures a more consistent application of the SBP Standard 1. However, there's obviously resource constraints to this. So we are in a process of discussing the priority countries, regions to be covered by risk assessments. And that includes the new trees outside forest instruction document.
Thank you. About are SBP pellets under version 1 RED 2 compliant until the transition period ends? So that will depend on the certification scope, and as your certificate is valid under version 1, and if you are as well compliant against the RED 2 requirements, then your pellets remain compliant with RED 2 as long as you maintain your valid certificates. Another question about the transition period. If a regular audit for a biomass producer are conducted in January, now I suppose 2024, does it mean the transition to the new standard must be completed during the audit in January 2024?
We have not set that rule. There is obviously a possibility to conduct another audit later on that in 2024 against the new version of the standard to confirm the compliance of the certificate holders. But obviously, most of us are keen to avoid more than one audit per year. So in practice, it would probably mean that you would want to consider having that audit in January 2024 against the new standard, unless you want to have another audit later on that year against the new standard.
Thank you. And then we have two questions that are slightly linked, so I will put them together. Could you please explain a bit more about how FSC certified material will be handled under SBP certification? Will there be any changes? And what is SBP certification achieving that cannot be achieved through the existing certification system, such as FSC and PEFC? So speaking a bit more about the benchmarking and recognition that we introduced in Standard 2.
Okay, thank you. So the current system is that FSC and PEFC certified feedstocks can enter SBP supply chain without additional scrutiny. This system, we are no longer able to maintain this approach. So the new approach will differentiate between primary feedstocks and processing residues. For processing residues, we will continue to accept FSC and PEFC certified feedstocks as equivalent to an SBP certified feedstock. So there will be no additional requirements for secondary feedstocks. However, for primary feedstocks, FSC and PEFC will play a role in our risk mitigation system. So concretely, if we have a regional risk assessment that identifies, let's say, health and safety in forestry and high conservation value management as the specified risk, then the question is, does FSC address these specified risks or not? And we have recently completed the benchmarking of FSC and PEFC. So let's say if we take FSC as an example, we can conclude that FSC adequately covers the HCV aspect and the health and safety aspect. So FSC will be, you could use FSC certification as a mitigation measure. So I think in practice, we will end up with a very similar system that we have at the moment. But there needs to always, certificate holders will always have to start with a risk assessment, and then FSC and PEFC certification will play a role in the risk mitigation.
Thank you, Laszlo. And with that, that was the end of the questions we received. So, few more minutes. If you want to post some last-minute question in the Q&A chat, please don't hesitate to put them.
There's a question on what can FSC, sorry, I didn't answer, what can FSC achieve, SBP achieve that FSC and PEFC cannot? So I think just a brief answer. So I don't think it's a competition. I think the approach was always to build on existing certification efforts. There's obviously some important elements such as principle-free forest carbon, which are not covered by FSC and PEFC. We are also achieved regulatory compliance in key consumer regions, which again, FSC and PEFC do not have at the moment. So I think there's a number of elements that make SBP an attractive choice in the bioenergy sector. But again, we never set out to sort of compete, and we will continue to build on these existing certification efforts.
And not to forget that SBP, during the SBP audits energy data on transport and production is collected, which FSC and PFC do not foresee in their systems, which is relevant for regulatory compliance.
Thank you very much. And a good question coming as well now is, for new customers, should we use the existing standard or the new standards?
I would encourage you to use the new standard if it's possible. It depends a bit on the stage that your customer is in terms of the preparations and when do they need an SBP certificate, but also if they operate in a country with a regional risk assessment. So the general advice would be to use the revised standard as soon as possible. But obviously, if your client needs a certificate, let's say in 3 weeks or a month's time, then obviously that will not be possible. So you'd have to use the old version of the current version of the standard.
Another question coming on the status of the risk assessment for Latvia. Is it still valid?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And so a question with regard to claims. What claims will be available? Will there still be an SBP controlled claim?
Yes, thank you. Very good question. Yes, so we are maintaining SBP controlled. It's a relatively small percentage of the overall certified volume. But based on feedback that we received from biomass producers, we are planning to maintain it. And it will rely on FSC controlled wood or PFC controlled sources inputs.
Thank you. And do we have a regional risk assessment for Australia?
We do not have a regional risk assessment for Australia. It is not at the moment on the list of the SBP Secretariat, but obviously we would be happy to discuss the need with biomass producers.
And a question on the recognition by regulatory body by Ofgem and LSCCC in the UK, if we have an indication of the timelines about that.
Would you have a bit more information about this, Nicholas?
No, we don't. And that will, again, it's a bit with the same system that with the EU, we are subject to the timelines of the regulatory bodies in their ability to allocate resources to provide approval of the revised standards. And that's the same for the various countries in which we are liaising directly with some of the regulatory bodies. A question with regard to RED 3. Is the intention to make compliance with RED 3 obligatory in due course? I can answer is for the moment, RED 3 is still in discussion by the European unions and the different parties involved. And we are, of course, following the discussion that are happening and making notes of those decisions.
But maybe overall, of course, there is no way around an upgrade from RED 2 to RED 3 when it comes in force for SBP.
And that would be it.
Take another deep breath. So it looks like there are no further questions coming in. And then I'd like to close the webinar for today. So please don't forget to share your feedback with us. Use the QR code or wait until after the presentation, and then we'll send a message to you with a link. We'll keep you informed and remind you about the trainings and the in-person workshops. And thank you very much all for your interest and participation. Have a good day. At 1700 CET time, we'll have a second session, which you can join as well if you like. All the best, take care, and see you soon. Now we'd like to go through the questions that have been submitted, and I'd like to invite our technical director, Nicholas Viat, and our assurance manager, Roman Polyachenko, to join us here so that we can take the questions as the group. And just to remind everyone and also the late joiners, please do not raise your digital hand. At the top of your page, you should have a button round about the same area as where the raise hand button is, called Q&A. So hit that Q&A button and submit your questions in writing so that we can take them on board and answer them. Also note that this webinar is intended to provide an initial high-level overview. So detailed Q&A is part of the online trainings. And the in-person workshops, as mentioned by Laszlo. In-person workshops will be starting in September, and we are planning to have in-person workshops in Southeast Asia, 1 or 2 in North America, and 1 in Europe. So over to Nicholas for the questions.
Thank you very much, Carsten. Thank you, Laszlo, for the presentation. Very insightful. So we have one question so far, so I encourage everyone to come and write any of your question need for clarification. The first one is with regard to the webinars that you mentioned, Laszlo. Will they be specific to category of certificate holders, traders, biomass producers, and end users, or will it be another format?
Thank you. We haven't planned so far to have specific trainings to various groups of certificate holders, but we can certainly consider it if there is an interest. So we can definitely take that on board. If you allow me, considering that there is no questions, maybe I can respond to some of the questions we received this morning, which might be also useful for the audience to this session. One question that we received this morning is from what date certification bodies can conduct certification against the revised standards, and that date is the 10th of August, which is the effective date for the standards. And between now and then, the SBP Secretariat and the certification bodies will have to make sure that all the systems, including reporting, but the competency of the auditors are in line with the revised standards.
So in the meantime, we receive another question, and I will turn to Roman for this one. Is there a big gap between the current RED II bridging document and the new standard?
Yeah, hello everyone. No, I don't think this gap is big. There is certain formalities, some like requirements in RED, which were very long and were not possible to include in the standards. That's why they are in the separate bridging document. But I think the spirit of the requirements are very similar. Since I see from whom this question is coming, then for traders and end users, I think the gap will be almost non-existent, because end users and traders receive the claim. It's going to be SBP RED II compliant claim, and for those guys, it should be very simple, almost no changes.
Thank you. Another one, and I'll turn to Laszlo for this one. Will all SBP certificate holders need to be RED II certified by the end of the transition period?
And the answer is yes. So by the end of the transition period, all certificate holders, we have to comply with the requirement of the revised standards and the EU RED II bridging document.
Very much. No questions so far.
Another question, while more questions come in, another question that we were asked this morning is relates to controlled claims. Are we maintaining an SBP control claim? And the answer is yes, based on the feedback that we have received from various certificate holders. we are maintaining the possibility to produce biomass with an SBP controlled claim. And this biomass can be produced using FSC controlled wood or PFC controlled sources feedstocks.
Thank you, Laszlo. We have a question, and I'll turn to Roman for this one as well, is will the new standards influence the SBP audit portal and the DTS, data transfer system, the online system SBP has developed to capture key information and data? And if yes, how will the work be organized during the transition period?
Yes, that's a very good question. As the normative requirements and standards have changed, then we will have, let's say, like two systems in parallel, the same audit portal, same login, everything, but you will be able to choose the correct template. So those companies who will decide to stay on the old standard, let's say they have audit in July, August, September, not yet ready to transition, they can still choose the old, or let's say legacy current templates to use in all the systems. And then those who want to transition will be able to choose the new templates. And our technical team, our particular data manager, is working on actually making sure that the kind of legacy old claims work with the new claims, and they will be definitely very smooth process. At the end of the transition period, of course, we will retire all templates, old system, and we'll continue just with the new one.
Thank you, Roman. Laszlo, maybe a clarification on the EU RED question. Is compliance with the EU RED required across all SBP compliant feedstock or just for the market that require RED 2 compliant claims?
In line with the decision of the SBP Standards Committee, RED 2 compliance is required across all SBP compliant feedstock, regardless of the market, the end user market. So all SBP certified biomass will have to be also EU RED 2 compliant. So even if, let's say, it goes from British Columbia to, I don't know, Japan, for example, it will have to be RED 2 compliant.
And the objective of this is to maintain, for now, SBP as a one-stop shop, incorporating all relevant regulatory requirements for legality and sustainability of woody feedstock.
Thank you. Roman, as our assurance manager, this question will be for you. Does being in compliance by the end of the transition period mean that certificate holders are audited by then, or audited and all non-conformities addressed by then?
That's a very good question. To be honest, I think we haven't analyzed this particular question. So I would preliminarily respond that all the major non-conformances would need to be addressed before transitioning to the new standard. And then the minor non-conformances can have 12 months, as we all know, the timeline. But Brandon, let us note this particular question, and we will cover this in the webinars during June, 1st of June. Definitely for training for certification bodies, we'll inform you about our decision.
And I think it's a good moment as well to indicate that we are collecting all your feedback, including the question we received this morning in the first session on the release and the launch, and the one of today. And that will help us to build up a Q&A document that we aim to make available for all stakeholders. No further questions so far.
Related to the transition. Sorry, Carsten. You go.
We had another question this morning I just wanted to throw in, which was in regard to the RED 3. So we have an awkward situation that a RED 3 has been decided before a RED 2 has been officially rolled out. And of course, SBP will also incorporate RED 3. It doesn't mean that RED 3 will automatically be mandatory, but we will need to upgrade our system to RED 3 going forward when it comes to address the specific market requirements. So there's no way for us to bypass the RED 3 when it comes into force. Laszlo, over to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the transition and the question on various versions. So we have been asked this morning if, let's say, an audit is conducted in January or February 2024, should that audit be conducted against the current version or the revised version. And yeah, so our response is that it still will be at sort of the choice of the certificate holder and the certification body. What is important though is that by the end of the transition period, compliance with the revised standards is confirmed by the certification body.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, we have another one. With regard to the transition in the fundability of the claims between V1 and V2, does a trader audited against V1 have to be audited against V2 before to trade EU red claim from a V2 producer, or is it possible within the transition to mix both? So if we look at, if we have a trader, yes or no, certified against EU red, how can they carry the claim of EU red across the supply chain? Is there a requirement to all the chains to be V1 or V2 certified?
Yeah, so basically what we are currently actually working on the solution for that, how to extend the scope of the trader certificate. We acknowledge that complete full audit, doing it just specifically for trader for adding red 2 may not be justified, but we are working with certification bodies to have a system where certification body still confirms readiness of the trader to expand the scope of the certificate, but without maybe full audit, full expansion audit. Yeah.
So there is one, yes, just one question, but it's not directly linked to the revision of the standard, but I'm happy to take that one. The transition period is similar to EUDR. When EUDR takes effect, will EUDR brand new requirements be considered? Now, this is from an SBP point of view, a key element to us as well to look at. We have initiating an investigation on how the requirement of the EUDR can be supported by certification against SBP. So this is something we look into more detail and provide feedback to the stakeholders to see how an SBP can play a role into the due diligence requirement as per the EUDR. We are as well investigating on the technology solution that the DTS offers already and that all of you certified are already using. But more, it requires investigation, and we are looking into that, and more will follow. So there is a question on the related on the red compliance. Now maybe we can as well slightly open the scope of this question around the recognition and benchmark of other claim for the SBP system. Laszlo, maybe you can redefine how the FSC, PFC claims will be used with the V2 standard, and we'll answer as well on how the other claims from other certification system are entering into an SBP system. If you want to take, Laszlo, the first part. Roman,
okay, so FSC and PFC. So at the moment, FSC and PFC feedstock can enter an SBP chain of custody, and the resulted biomass can carry an SBP compliant or SBP controlled claim. So we are no longer able to maintain this blanket recognition of these claims, and so we are moving away towards a slightly more complex system, but I hope that in the end it will, from a practical point of view, it will still have the same benefits as the current system. So for secondary feedstocks, processing residues feedstock, where we have a bit more freedom on how to proceed, we will continue to recognize FSC and PFC claims. So for processing residues feedstocks, feedstock that carries an FSC or PFC claim can enter a SBP supply chain, and the resulted biomass carry an SBP claim. For primary feedstocks, we will use FSC and PFC in our risk mitigation approach. So, for example, if we have let's say, a regional risk assessment that identifies health and safety and HCVs as a specified risk, then the question is, does FSC or PFC adequately address these topics? And if the conclusion is yes, then the certified status of that feedstock can be used in the risk mitigation approach. So I think at the end we will have the same sort of outcome as we have at the moment, and we want to continue to build on existing certification efforts and avoid duplication whenever it's possible.
Thank you very much. And Roman, do you want to address the second part of the question on other scheme with regard to RED 2 compliance?
Yes, that is absolutely true, that we are required to recognize other claims from other recognized schemes. However, we are doing this at the level of feedstock, so at the level of the biomass producer. And reasons for this is that our system includes DTS, so everything needs to be traced in DTS system. It also includes tools like SAR. So let's say like our system wouldn't possibly allow material coming in the form of pellets. So if the pellet mill has been certified under other scheme, there would be, let's say, no mechanism to pass this claim into our system because it would lack the SAR, it would lack transactions through DTS. So that's why we are limiting this recognition to the feedstock level only. And then, of course, like another very important component is that in our system, RED 2 compliant claim needs to be accompanied by the SBP compliant claim. So, and then, of course, verification of pellets against our standard 2 and 1 is not possible. You need to always start at the level of the feedstock, at the level of the biomass producer. So like I'm sure like if biomass producers want to use those claims at the level of feedstock for RED 2 section region document, that's fine, that can be used, but they shouldn't forget that they also need to comply with our standard 2 and 1, which frankly drops a little bit the value of those claims, since we have our requirements which go beyond RED 2.
Thank you, Roman. And with that, I will hand over back to Carsten.
Thank you all, and thank you all for the questions. Very content of the time. We don't want to steal too much of your time today, so the launch webinar has come to an end. Please don't forget to share your views and do the short survey. It'll just take you a couple of minutes, not very long. Just to remind, we will inform and remind you about the trainings and the in-person workshops in emails. Overall, thank you for your interest and participation today. Have a good day, all the best, and keep safe. See you soon.